The alarm on Emma's mother's phone had buzzed at 5:47 a.m. that morning, pulling everyone from an uneasy sleep. Emma hadn't slept well. She never did on nights before big events. Her mind had been spinning with questions and fears she didn't fully understand. What would the courtroom look like? Would Daddy be okay? What if the bad man got away? Her 7-year-old brain couldn't quite grasp the complexity of what was happening, but she understood one crucial thing. Today mattered enormously to her family. Maria Martinez, Emma's mother, had spent an hour getting her daughter ready, choosing a modest navy blue dress with small white flowers. "You need to look nice," Maria had explained gently, brushing Emma's long dark hair and pulling it into a neat ponytail. "The judge will see that our family is respectful and truthful." Emma had nodded seriously, understanding that this was important in some way she couldn't fully articulate. Her father had been attacked 6 months ago, half a year that had felt like an eternity to a 7-year-old. The incident had shattered the safety Emma had always taken for granted. Before that day, her father had been invincible, someone who helped people and kept the community safe. Then came that horrible phone call. Then the hospital visits. Then the slow, painful recovery. Officer David Martinez had been a police officer for 15 years, ever since Emma was born. He had always been her hero, the man who came home with stories about helping people, who taught her about right and wrong, who made her feel protected. But on that evening 6 months ago, protection had failed. A routine traffic stop had turned into something terrifying. A suspect had pulled a knife. Her father had been slashed across the arm and chest before backup arrived. The wounds had healed, but the psychological scars remained for everyone. Emma sometimes heard her parents talking at night, her mother's voice tight with worry as she asked about her father's nightmares. Officer Martinez had returned to light duty, but he wouldn't return to full service until this case was resolved. Today was that resolution. The drive to the courthouse had been quiet. Emma sat in the back seat, her hands folded in her lap, watching the city transform around her. They left their residential neighborhood with its familiar houses and parks, passing through downtown streets she rarely saw. The buildings grew taller, more imposing, more official-looking. Finally, they turned onto a street lined with government buildings, all stone and columns and an air of grave importance. The Pierce County Superior Court building dominated the block, a massive structure of granite and glass that seemed to touch the clouds. Emma's stomach tightened as they parked. "Remember what we talked about," her mother had said, turning to look at Emma in the back seat. "We're going to be very quiet and very respectful. The judge is an important man, and the lawyers are going to be talking about what happened to Daddy. You might hear things that are upsetting, but I want you to remember that we're there to help Daddy tell the truth. Can you do that for me?" Emma had nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was agreeing to. Now, as they walked through the imposing front doors, Emma felt her hand being pulled into her mother's grip. The lobby of the courthouse was vast and echoing, with high ceilings that made every footstep sound amplified and important. People moved about with purpose, lawyers carrying thick briefcases, court officials in official clothing, police officers in uniform. Her father was already inside, seated at a table near the front. When he saw them, his face softened with a mixture of love and sadness. He stood up carefully. His left arm still wasn't quite as strong as it used to be, and squeezed his wife and daughter gently. His uniform was pressed perfectly, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. But Emma could see the tension in his jaw, the way his shoulders were slightly too rigid. They were ushered into the courtroom itself, and that's when Emma's breath caught in her throat. The room was nothing like she'd imagined. She'd seen courtrooms on television, but nothing had prepared her for the reality. The space was enormous and formal, with wood paneling and official seals, and an elevated bench at the front where the judge would sit. The jury box held 12 empty chairs, waiting to be filled by people who would decide whether the bad man was guilty. There were newspapers scattered across some seats, reporters, her mother whispered, media. This case was important enough for news. And then there was him, the defendant, sitting at the defense table with his attorney. Emma's eyes landed on him, and she felt a chill run through her small body. He was a thin man with angry eyes, and those eyes seemed to drill into her father with undisguised hostility. This was the man who had hurt her father. This was the man who had pulled a knife and slashed and tried to destroy her family's peace. Looking at him, Emma felt afraid in a way she'd never experienced before. Not the ordinary fear of the dark or scary movies. This was primal. This was recognition that evil existed in the world and wore human form. Maria gently guided Emma to the back row of the courtroom, settling her into a wooden seat that was far too big for her small frame. Her mother sat beside her, holding her hand. Emma's father gave them one last reassuring look before turning his attention to his lawyer, a stern-looking man named Robert who had been preparing for this trial for months. The courtroom continued to fill. Lawyers arranged papers at their tables. Court officials moved about with clipboards and important-looking documents. The bailiff made announcements that Emma didn't fully understand. Then, the judge entered, and everyone stood respectfully. Judge Harrison was an older man with silver hair and deep lines around his eyes, lines that suggested he had seen a great deal in his life. He wore black robes that made him look even more imposing and official. He surveyed the courtroom with an expression of complete neutrality, his gaze passing over everyone present. Emma's leg bounced nervously under the bench. The courtroom seemed to grow warmer, more stifling. Her mother squeezed her hand. Emma squeezed back, seeking comfort from the familiar touch. And then, just as the judge was about to begin, something caught Emma's eye. Movement, a flash of golden-brown fur. A German shepherd in a police vest was led into the courtroom by a handler. The dog was magnificent, large and alert, with intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. The dog's name, Emma would later learn, was Duke, a K-9 unit officer who had played a crucial role in apprehending after the attack. Duke moved with calm purpose, settling into a lying position near the prosecution table, his head resting on his paws but his eyes remaining alert, watchful, aware. There was something about the dog's presence that seemed to steady Emma's racing heart. While everything else in the courtroom felt chaotic and intimidating, Duke radiated quiet confidence and truth-seeking purpose. Emma realized she wasn't entirely alone in this overwhelming space. Somewhere in this room, there was another being who understood that right and wrong mattered, who had helped bring the truth to light. That understanding would change everything. Had been practicing law for 22 years, and in that time, she had developed a philosophy that had served her exceptionally well. Truth was negotiable, justice was subjective, and the law was a game to be played with precision and without mercy. She had successfully defended 43 accused criminals, and of those, 31 had walked free. Her success rate was legendary in legal circles, whispered about in courthouse hallways and law school classrooms. Some admired her tenacity, others feared her ruthlessness. Didn't care which. All that mattered was winning. Was technically her client but barely knew him beyond the case file. A 28-year-old man with a history of petty crimes, a failed education and an explosive temper. He'd claimed self-defense during the police stop, insisted that Officer Martinez had approached him aggressively, that he'd been terrified for his life, that the knife was merely a reaction to perceived threat. It was a weak defense, objectively speaking. The evidence against him was substantial, but had built her career on taking weak defenses and transforming them into reasonable doubt. It was her superpower, her art form, her reason for existing in this profession. She'd spent 3 weeks preparing for this trial, interviewing, studying the evidence, and most importantly, identifying the weak points in the prosecution's case. There were always weak points. The prosecution's witnesses had to be discredited, their memories questioned, their motives examined. The evidence had to be reframed from damning to ambiguous. The narrative had to shift from criminal attacked officer to misunderstanding escalated by an overzealous police response. It was a delicate dance, but was a master choreographer. The trial had begun that morning with opening statements. The prosecution had painted a picture of a vicious, unprovoked attack, had countered with questions about police procedures, officer training, and the possibility that her client had acted out of fear rather than malice. She'd seen the jury's faces shift slightly, not much, but enough. Enough to know that her seeds of doubt were taking root. Now, as the prosecution's first witnesses took the stand, sat at the defense table with a notepad in front of her, her pen poised to strike. The first witness was Officer Michael, the second officer on the scene who had helped apprehend. He was a career cop with 15 years on the force, solid and reliable. The prosecution asked him gentle questions, allowing him to tell his story without challenge. Officer described arriving at the scene, finding Officer Martinez bleeding, and seeing the suspect attempting to flee. He described the quick thinking and bravery of the officers involved. He described Duke tracking the suspect and helping to apprehend him safely. It was a compelling narrative. Could see the jury leaning forward slightly, their sympathies aligning with the prosecution. This would not do. When it was time for cross-examination, rose from her seat with deliberate slowness, her tailored charcoal suit crisp and professional, her expression neutral and calm. She had learned long ago that the courtroom was a stage, and she was a consummate actress. She approached the witness stand with measured steps, her heels clicking against the marble floor, a sound designed to command attention. "Officer," she began, her voice smooth as silk but edged with steel. "You were not present when the initial contact between my client and Officer Martinez occurred, correct?" Officer shifted slightly. "That's correct. I arrived approximately 4 minutes after the first dispatch call." 4 minutes, repeated, letting the phrase hang in the air as if it meant everything. "A lot can change in 4 minutes, wouldn't you say?" "I suppose so, but—" "And during those 4 minutes, you have no direct knowledge of what actually happened between my client and Officer Martinez, do you?" "Well, no, but Officer Martinez—" held up a hand. "Please just answer my questions, officer, yes or no." The judge intervened gently. "Officer, please answer the question directly." Officer's jaw tightened. "No, I don't have direct knowledge of what happened during those 4 minutes." Smiled thinly. "Thank you. Now, when you arrived on scene, what was your first observation?" "I observed Officer Martinez with injuries, the suspect attempting to flee, and several civilians pointing in the direction the suspect had gone." "So Officer Martinez was injured, but you have no knowledge of who inflicted those injuries, do you? You found Officer Martinez in that state, but you didn't witness the event that caused it." "The evidence—" "That's not what I asked. Do you have direct knowledge of who caused Officer Martinez's injuries?" Officer's face had flushed red. "No, I don't have direct knowledge." "Exactly. You arrived after the fact and formed conclusions based on assumptions and the narrative presented to you by other officers. You didn't actually see what happened, correct?" It was brilliant legal maneuvering. Knew that officer had nothing to hide, that he was telling the truth to the best of his knowledge. But she wasn't interested in truth. She was interested in creating the appearance of doubt. She was interested in making the jury question whether officer's interpretation was objective or whether he'd simply accepted the official narrative without question. "One more question," continued, packing back and forth like a predator. "Officer, in your training at the police academy, were you taught that police officers sometimes have to make split-second decisions that might later appear excessive, but were justified given the circumstances of the moment?" The prosecution immediately objected, but the damage was already done. The jury had heard the implication that police officers were trained to use force reflexively, that their responses might appear aggressive but were actually just protocol. Sat back down, satisfied. She'd planted another seed of doubt. Over the next several hours, executed her strategy with surgical precision. She called into question the chain of custody for evidence. She asked whether Officer Martinez might have been the aggressor. She suggested that the knife might have been produced only after the officer approached aggressively. She implied that the police had a vested interest in presenting a narrative that protected their own. Each question was calibrated to introduce uncertainty without making an outrageous claim. The prosecution's witnesses found themselves increasingly defensive, their certainty eroding under relentless questioning. She had a gift for finding the moment when a witness's confidence wavered, and she pounced on those moments like a lion on wounded prey. By mid-afternoon, could see the shift in the jury box. The 12 jurors who had appeared sympathetic that morning now looked conflicted, uncertain, troubled by the questions had raised. They were no longer certain that was guilty. They were no longer certain of anything except that the prosecution's case contained gaps that had skillfully widened with each cross-examination. Emma watched from the back row, not fully understanding the legal maneuvering, but understanding something on a deeper level, that this woman in the tailored suit was trying very hard to make people believe that her father was lying. That understanding made Emma's small hands clench into fists. As officer, the third witness for the prosecution, was called to the stand to discuss the police dog's role in apprehending the suspect, felt confident that her strategy was working. The defense was gaining ground. Reasonable doubt was taking root. This case, which had seemed so clear-cut at the beginning of the day, was becoming murky, complicated, uncertain. Smiled to herself. She was winning, and winning was all that mattered to her. The afternoon sun had shifted position, casting long shadows through the tall courtroom windows. It was approaching 3 p.m., and everyone in the room could feel the weight of the day pressing down on them. The prosecution had called their final witness, Officer James, no relation to the defendant, who had been the first responder to assess the scene and had coordinated the police dog's involvement in apprehending the suspect. This was crucial testimony, the kind that could tip the scales back toward guilt if delivered effectively. Officer was a 20-year veteran of the police force, a man whose calm demeanor and precise recollection of events had made him an invaluable witness countless times before. He settled into the witness stand with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to this process. His uniform was impeccable, his posture military straight, his expression grave but composed. He understood the importance of this moment, understood that his words might determine whether justice was served or whether a guilty man walked free. The prosecution's lead attorney, Robert, approached the witness with confidence. Unlike predatory stalking, Robert's movement was purposeful but respectful. Officer, you were the first officer to fully assess the crime scene. Can you walk the jury through what you found? Officer took a measured breath. I arrived at approximately 4:47 p.m. Officer Martinez was being treated by paramedics for lacerations to his left arm and upper chest. He was conscious and alert, able to provide preliminary information about the suspect. The suspect, later identified as, had fled the scene on foot. I immediately coordinated with the K-9 unit to deploy our tracking dog, Duke, to locate and apprehend the suspect. And what happened next? Robert asked gently. Duke's handler, Officer Maria Santos, released Duke to track the suspect's scent. Duke was exceptional. He tracked through 3 blocks of residential neighborhood, through 2 yards, and ultimately located the suspect hiding in the crawl space beneath an abandoned building on 5th End. The suspect had a knife with him, the same knife later identified as the weapon used to cut Officer Martinez. Emma listened intently, her small frame perched on the edge of the wooden bench. Her mother's hand remained steady on her shoulder, a constant reassuring pressure. As Officer continued describing Duke's role in the apprehension, something shifted within Emma's understanding of the situation. She could picture it all, Duke's intelligence and bravery, the way the dog had worked to protect the community, the physical evidence that proved her father was telling the truth. Officer continued, his voice steady and clear. The knife was recovered at the scene and later identified as the weapon that caused Officer Martinez's injuries. Forensic analysis confirmed that the blood on the knife matched Officer Martinez's DNA. Additionally, we found the suspect's fingerprints on the knife handle. His face had darkened slightly during this testimony. Emma could see the defense attorney scribbling notes furiously, calculating how to minimize the damage. But the damage was clear and indisputable. The knife, the fingerprints, the dog's tracking, it all pointed to a single inescapable conclusion: had attacked Officer Martinez with a knife and had fled the scene. "Officer," Robert continued, "I want to ask you about the dog's role specifically. In your professional experience, how reliable is a K-9 unit in tracking and locating suspects?" "Extremely reliable," Officer responded without hesitation. "Dogs have olfactory capabilities that exceed human sensory perception by orders of magnitude. Duke specifically is one of the finest tracking dogs I've encountered in my career. He's been part of the police force for 6 years, has successfully tracked over 200 suspects, and has never given a false alert." The prosecution was building a compelling case. Emma could see the jury members leaning forward, their earlier uncertainty replaced by growing conviction. The seeds of doubt that had planted were being uprooted and replaced with solid, irrefutable facts. Robert stepped back. "Thank you, officer, no further questions." Stood up immediately, her demeanor sharp and focused. She had to do something to salvage her case, to find some angle, some weakness in officer's testimony. She approached the witness stand, her heels clicking against the marble floor, that same strategic sound that commanded attention. "Officer, you mentioned that Duke has never given a false alert in his career. But dogs are animals, aren't they? They can be influenced by handler behavior, by expectations, by the tone of voice used in commands. Dogs can pick up on certain cues, yes, but Duke is extensively trained too." "That's not what I asked. A simple yes or no would suffice. Can dogs be influenced by handler behavior?" "Yes," officer conceded, his jaw tightening slightly. "And is it possible that Officer Santos, knowing that Officer Martinez had been attacked, might have unconsciously communicated her expectations to Duke, influencing where he tracked?" "It's highly unlikely. Officer Santos is a professional." "Again, I'm not asking for your opinion on Officer Santos's professionalism. I'm asking if it's possible." "Technically possible, but—" "Thank you. So we can't be 100% certain that Duke led you to the correct location, can we?" Officer looked frustrated. "With respect, ma'am, the knife with the suspect's fingerprints was found at that location. The forensic evidence is tangible evidence that supports the prosecution's narrative, yes. But my question was specifically about the dog's reliability, and you've just acknowledged that it's possible, however unlikely, that the dog could have been influenced. Correct?" This was skill on full display. She wasn't interested in truth or likely scenarios. She was interested in finding technical admissions that could be twisted into seeds of doubt. She'd succeeded again, turning officer's testimony from damning to ambiguous in the eyes of a jury that was beginning to look confused once more. Emma felt her mother's grip on her shoulder tighten imperceptibly. The little girl could sense the shift in the courtroom's energy. The prosecution's advantage was being eroded once again. Officer was dismissed, and the judge announced that court would reconvene after a brief recess. During that recess, Emma remained seated while her mother went to speak with her father. The little girl sat quietly, watching Duke lie beside the prosecution table, watching the dog's intelligent eyes move around the courtroom, observing everything. Duke never blinked away. Duke never looked uncertain. The dog possessed a clarity that everyone else in the courtroom seemed to lack. As people began returning from recess, Emma continued to stare at Duke. She thought about her father's face when about the absolute sincerity in his voice when he described the attack. She thought about officers' descriptions of the knife, the fingerprints, the evidence. She thought about all the adults in this room who seemed confused about what was true and what wasn't. But Duke never looked confused. Duke watched with unwavering certainty. Something crystallized in Emma's 7-year-old mind, a clarity, a sudden understanding that transcended the legal complexities surrounding her. She stood up slightly, her small body tense with the need to communicate something vital. Her mother was still speaking with her father, distracted, not watching. Officer was being dismissed, walking past the prosecution table toward the exit. The judge was reviewing documents, was making notes, planning her next move. The courtroom was in that transitional moment between witnesses, that moment of administrative pause. Emma's hand lifted, her small finger extending toward Duke. She understood something fundamental that all the lawyers and judges seemed to have forgotten. Truth was simple. Truth was clear. And truth was sitting right there in a police vest, watching with eyes that never wavered. Emma's voice, small but crystalline, cut through the din of the courtroom. The moment stretched like taffy, becoming longer and longer, filling every space in the courtroom with electric silence. Emma's small hand remained extended, her tiny finger pointing directly at Duke. The German shepherd, as if understanding the significance of this gesture, lifted his head slightly and turned to look directly at the child. For a split second, just a fraction of a moment that would reverberate through the rest of the trial, there was a connection between the 7-year-old girl and the police dog, a recognition, a shared understanding of truth. That dog knows the truth. The words emerged from Emma's mouth with surprising clarity, each syllable distinct and precise despite her small voice. They hung in the courtroom air like a physical presence, like something tangible that everyone could feel. For what felt like an eternity but was actually only 3 or 4 seconds, complete and total silence consumed the room. No one moved. No one spoke. No one seemed to breathe. Judge Harrison had been reviewing documents on the bench, his reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. At the sound of Emma's voice, his head snapped up with a jerk. His eyes found the source of the disturbance, a small girl in a navy blue dress standing in the back row of the courtroom, her hands still extended, her face serious and determined. The judge's expression was impossible to read, but something flickered across his weathered features. Surprise, certainly. But also something else, something that might have been recognition or understanding. Maria Martinez's face had gone pale and then rapidly flushed to crimson. She gasped audibly and immediately reached out, trying to pull her daughter back down into her seat. "I'm so sorry, Your Honor," she whispered frantically, her voice trembling with embarrassment and maternal panic. She didn't mean, "I'm terribly sorry. She's just a child. She doesn't understand." Emma's mother urged, pulling her daughter down forcefully enough that Emma stumbled slightly before collapsing back into the wooden bench seat. Emma's mother continued murmuring apologies to everyone around them, her face burning with shame. This was the opposite of what she'd prepared Emma for: quiet respect, not dramatic outbursts. What must everyone be thinking? How could her daughter have done this? But something extraordinary was happening in the courtroom that Maria Martinez couldn't see because she was too focused on her own humiliation and on trying to quiet her daughter. His pen had frozen mid-motion over her legal pad. Her sharp, calculating eyes had narrowed to slits, and her perfectly composed face had gone rigid. For the first time that entire day, looked rattled. Not just slightly off balance, but genuinely unsettled. She had built her entire career on controlling narratives, on managing information, on dictating the flow of testimony and evidence. A 7-year-old girl had just stepped outside all known parameters, had introduced an element into the courtroom that couldn't control or manipulate. His jaw clenched, and she quickly lowered her gaze back to her legal pad, but her hand was shaking slightly. The prosecution team exchanged looks of surprise. Robert's eyebrows had risen toward his hairline, and he appeared torn between concern for the family's outburst and something that looked like quiet satisfaction. The jury members were frozen in their seats, their heads turned toward Emma like they were following a tennis match that had just taken an unexpected turn. But the most significant reaction came from Judge Harrison. The judge had removed his reading glasses slowly and deliberately, setting them down on the bench in front of him with careful precision. His weathered face, which had maintained an expression of judicial neutrality throughout the entire day, underwent a transformation. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, the eyes of a man who had studied human nature and the law for nearly 4 decades, fixed themselves on the small girl in the back row. He looked at her for a long moment, really looked at her, as if he were seeing something that had been invisible to everyone else in the room. Then, and this was the moment that would be discussed in legal circles for months afterward, Judge's gaze shifted from Emma to Duke. The police dog had not moved or made any sound. Duke was still lying in his resting position beside the prosecution table, but his eyes were alert and focused, watching the proceedings with complete awareness. It was almost as if the dog understood that something fundamental had just shifted. The judge looked back at Emma one more time, and something that might have been a smile, barely perceptible, just a slight softening at the corners of his mouth, crossed his face. He replaced his glasses with deliberate slowness, and then he did something that surprised everyone in the courtroom. He leaned back in his judge's chair and remained silent. The courtroom waited. What would he do? Would he scold the child? Would he hold Maria Martinez in contempt for the disruption? Would he continue as if nothing had happened? Judge said nothing. He simply sat in his elevated position, his expression thoughtful, his fingers steepled together in front of him. It was a moment of profound contemplation. In that silence, something shifted in the entire trajectory of the trial. The certainty that had existed that morning, the prosecution's conviction that they had an airtight case, the defense's manipulation of doubt, all of it seemed to hang suspended in that moment. Officer James, who had been dismissed from the witness stand and was still in the process of leaving the courtroom, had paused. He looked back at the judge, at Emma, at Duke, waiting to see what would happen next. Even he sensed that something seismic had just occurred. Emma sat in her seat, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. She had said it. She had spoken the truth that her 7-year-old mind understood so clearly. The dog knew the truth. The dog had never wavered from the truth. The dog's integrity was absolute and unquestionable. Her mother's grip on her shoulder was now a vice, squeezing with tension and mortification. "I'm so sorry," Maria continued to whisper to anyone within earshot. "She doesn't understand courtroom procedure. She's just a child. Please forgive us." But Emma felt no shame. She had done what she needed to do. She had pointed at the truth, embodied in the form of a loyal dog who understood right and wrong in ways that transcended legal maneuvering and courtroom procedure. His hands trembled slightly as she made notes, clearly calculating how to salvage her position, how to minimize the impact of a child's innocent but destabilizing observation. She was formulating arguments, preparing counter-strategies, doing what she did best, attempting to regain control of a narrative that had just spiraled beyond her grasp. Judge Harrison sat silently for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only 30 seconds. In that silence, every person in the courtroom understood that the trial had just fundamentally changed. The judge's eyes moved across the room, from Emma to Duke to the prosecution to the defense to the jury, taking in everyone and everything with a new intensity. Finally, the judge cleared his throat. He was about to speak, and everyone in the courtroom held their breath, waiting to hear what wisdom or judgment or decision would emerge from the mouth of a judge who had just been reminded, by a 7-year-old girl, of something essential about his own profession. Judge Harrison removed his glasses with deliberate slowness and set them on the polished mahogany bench before him. His weathered hands, the hands of a man who had written thousands of judicial decisions and signed countless orders, came together in a steeple beneath his chin. He remained silent for another long moment, his gray eyes moving across the courtroom with an intensity that seemed to penetrate every person present. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried the weight of decades of judicial experience. "I have been sitting on this bench for 38 years, he began, his tone measured and reflective. 38 years. Do you know what that means? It means I have presided over more than 2,000 trials, 2,000 cases. I have seen the best of the law and the worst of the law. I have witnessed justice served and justice betrayed. I have seen truth triumph, and I have seen it buried beneath clever legal strategy and procedural manipulation." He paused, letting his words settle into the courtroom like sediment falling through water. Had gone absolutely still, her pen froze in midair. Robert, the prosecution's lead attorney, leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued but his expression carefully neutral. "And do you know what I learned?" Judge continued, his voice growing stronger. "I learned that justice is not found in procedure. It is not found in the clever cross-examination or in the perfectly constructed legal argument. Justice is found in truth, simple, uncomplicated, fundamental truth." He stood up slowly from his chair, and the entire courtroom seemed to inhale collectively. A judge standing during a trial was unusual. Most judges remained seated, elevated above the proceedings. But Judge rose to his full height, commanding the space with an authority that transcended his position. "That child," he said, his gaze settling on Emma with unmistakable warmth and recognition, "just taught me something I had begun to forget." She pointed at that dog and said something that seems simple on the surface but contains profound wisdom. "That dog knows the truth." And she was right. That dog has no agenda. That dog cannot be manipulated by clever legal strategies. That dog cannot be confused by procedural arguments. That dog understands, on a fundamental and uncomplicated level, what is true and what is false. His face had flushed a deep red. She stood up abruptly. "Your Honor, I object to this character assassination disguised as judicial commentary. My client's right to a fair defense." "Sit down," Judge said quietly, but with such firmness that immediately her teeth clenched so tightly that the muscles in her jaw visibly tensed. "Ms., you have done your job. You have raised questions. You have introduced doubt. And perhaps in some cases that doubt would be justified. But I have had an epiphany in the last 60 seconds and I am going to act on it." He turned to the prosecution's table. "Mr., I am aware that there is body camera footage from Officer Martinez's equipment on the day of the incident. This footage was entered into evidence and made available to both the defense and prosecution 3 weeks ago, but it has not yet been presented to the jury." Robert nodded carefully. "Yes, Your Honor, we have that footage available." "I am ordering that this footage be presented to the jury immediately, before this trial concludes." The courtroom erupted into chaos, was on her feet again, shouting objections. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We haven't agreed to the timing of this presentation. This violates proper procedure. My client has the right to—" "Your client," Judge interrupted, his voice cutting through protests like a blade through silk, "has the right to a fair trial. A fair trial means that the jury will have access to all relevant evidence, including physical evidence that speaks to the truth more clearly than any lawyer's argument. I am overruling your objection." He turned to the bailiff. "Please set up the monitors. We will present this footage immediately." "Your Honor," tried again, desperation creeping into her usually controlled voice, "this is an unprecedented action. We should have a hearing about this. We should discuss the implications." "Ms., I understand your concern," Judge said, his tone not unkind but absolutely immovable. "And you are correct that this is unusual. However, I have judicial discretion, and I am exercising it now. Justice requires that this jury sees what actually happened, not what we can convince them happened through argument and implication." He looked directly at Emma, and his expression softened considerably. "The young lady in the back row has reminded me that I took an oath to serve justice, not to preside over a game. I intend to honor that oath now." The courtroom had descended into a state of controlled but palpable chaos. Court officers were setting up video monitors at angles where the jury could see clearly. Bailiffs were making adjustments. Reporters were frantically scribbling notes and whispering into their phones. The energy in the room had fundamentally shifted. The trial was no longer a delicate balance between prosecution and defense. The trial had become something else entirely. It had become a pursuit of truth, and the judge had just declared himself its champion. Emma's mother had stopped whispering apologies. Instead, she was gripping her daughter's hand so tightly that Emma could barely feel her fingers. Tears were streaming down Maria's face, tears of relief and hope, and something that might have been vindication. Her small daughter had not only spoken up, but she had somehow activated something within the judge, some dormant sense of justice that had been awakened by an innocent observation. Officer Martinez, seated at the prosecution table, had placed his hand over his mouth. His shoulders rose and fell as if he was struggling to control his emotions. This moment, this unexpected moment, represented validation of everything he had endured. The truth was finally going to be presented without filter, without manipulation, without the veil of legal strategy. Had sat back down in her chair, but her jaw was still clenched, and her hands were white-knuckled as she gripped the edge of the defense table. She knew what was coming. She knew what the body camera footage would show: Officer Martinez being professional and respectful, her client attacking with a knife, a clear-cut case of guilt. The defense strategy she had carefully constructed over weeks of preparation was about to be demolished in the next few minutes. The doubt she had so skillfully planted would be uprooted and replaced with irrefutable visual evidence. Judge resumed his seat on the bench. "I want to say something to everyone in this courtroom," he continued, his voice carrying a new authority and passion. "We often speak about the law as if it is some abstract concept, separate from morality and truth, but that is a corruption of what the law is supposed to be. The law exists to serve justice. The law exists to protect the innocent and hold the guilty accountable. The law exists to discover and affirm truth." He looked directly at the jury. "You have been presented with testimony and argument. You have been asked to interpret evidence through the lens of legal procedure. But in a few moments, you are going to see something that transcends argument and procedure. You are going to see the truth recorded in real time. I ask that you look at that footage with clear eyes and honest hearts. Ask yourselves not what the lawyers want you to believe, but what the evidence actually shows." His gaze moved too. "And to the defense, I say this: justice is not about winning or losing. Justice is about truth. Sometimes our role as officers of the court requires us to stand against our own interests in service of something higher." The monitors flickered to life, displaying the start menu for the body camera footage. The entire courtroom held its breath, waiting for the images that would determine the fate of and validate or destroy the strategies of both legal teams. Emma sat in her seat, her small hand still gripped in her mother's, understanding in some fundamental way that she had done something important. She had reminded a tired judge why he had become a judge in the first place. She had spoken truth to power, and power had listened. The courtroom fell into a tense silence as the body camera footage began to play. The video feed from Officer Martinez's chest-mounted camera flickered to life, showing a street view that Emma immediately recognized. It was the intersection near her father's usual patrol route, just a few blocks from their home. The timestamp in the corner of the screen read, 4:32 p.m. 6 months ago, the day everything changed. The footage showed Officer Martinez approaching a vehicle with the measured, professional gait that his training had instilled in him. His hand rested near his duty belt, but his posture was open and unthreatening. His voice could be heard on the recording, calm and measured. "Good afternoon. I'm going to need your license, registration, and proof of insurance. You were exceeding the speed limit back there." The suspect was visible through the vehicle's window, and his demeanor was already agitated. "Why'd you stop me? I wasn't speeding. You're harassing me." "Sir, I clocked you at 52 miles per hour in a 35 zone, Officer Martinez replied, his tone remaining professional despite the suspect's hostile tone. "Your license and registration, please." Got out of the vehicle, and this was where the footage would become crucial. Instead of complying with the officer's request, immediately became aggressive, his hands balling into fists. "This is bullshit. You pigs always target people like me." Officer Martinez took a small step back, his hand moving to his chest in a defensive gesture. "Sir, I need you to calm down. Return to your vehicle and provide your documentation." "Fuck you," screamed, and then shockingly, he reached into his jacket. The jury members all leaned forward simultaneously, their eyes glued to the monitors. This was the critical moment. Face had gone absolutely ashen. She knew what was about to happen. She had known all along. Her entire strategy had been to create doubt where none could reasonably exist, to make the jury question their own eyes, to transform violence into a matter of perspective. Officer Martinez's hand moved to his duty belt, his body tensing in response to the perceived threat. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Pulled out a knife, a large hunting knife with a wicked-looking blade that gleamed in the sunlight. He didn't say anything. He simply moved forward with the knife raised, his face twisted in rage. "Drop the weapon," Officer Martinez commanded, his voice sharp and authoritative. But didn't drop the weapon. He lunged forward, slashing at Officer Martinez with a wild, vicious motion. Officer Martinez managed to dodge partially, but the knife connected with his upper left arm, tearing through flesh and fabric. Blood sprayed across the front of the vehicle. Backup needed." Officer Martinez's voice came through the recording, urgent but still controlled. He reached for his own weapon, and within seconds, the sound of additional sirens could be heard in the distance. Made another lunge, and this time Officer Martinez was ready. He deployed his baton, striking the suspect's wrist with enough force to dislodge the knife. The weapon fell to the pavement and shrieked, nursing his injured wrist. The footage continued for another minute, showing Officer Martinez maintaining control of the situation while bleeding from his arm, calling for additional backup, warning the suspect not to move. His professionalism under pressure was stunning. There was no overreaction. There was no excessive force. There was a trained law enforcement officer responding to a deadly threat with exactly the appropriate level of response. When the footage ended, the entire courtroom seemed to exhale simultaneously. The jury members looked shaken. Some had their hands over their mouths. One older woman, the jury foreman, had tears streaming down her face. The evidence was irrefutable. It was impossible to interpret what they had just seen in any way other than as a clear, unprovoked attack against Officer Martinez. The silence that followed was profound and complete. Had closed her eyes. Her pen had dropped from her fingers and rolled across the defense table, coming to rest at the edge. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the reality of what everyone had just witnessed. Her strategy of creating reasonable doubt had been rendered obsolete. You cannot create reasonable doubt in the face of video evidence showing an unprovoked knife attack. Robert, the prosecution attorney, sat perfectly still, his expression neutral but his eyes bright with the satisfaction of vindication. He did not gloat or celebrate. He simply allowed the evidence to speak for itself. Officer Martinez had covered his face with his hands. His shoulders were shaking, and when he looked up, tears were streaming down his face. After 6 months of fighting to be believed, after enduring insinuations that he might have been the aggressor, after living with the fear that justice might not be served, the truth had been revealed in undeniable, irrefutable form. Emma's mother was gripping her daughter so tightly that Emma could barely breathe, but she didn't complain. Her mother's tears had soaked into her hair, and her mother was making small sobbing sounds that she was trying very hard to contain. Emma watched her mother's face and understood, at a level deeper than words, that her mother had been terrified that the truth might not prevail. But it had. Because Emma had pointed at the dog, because the judge had listened. Judge was watching the jury with intense focus. He was studying their reactions, reading their faces, understanding that the evidence had done exactly what it was supposed to do. It had revealed the truth beyond any possibility of distortion or misinterpretation. "I think," Judge said quietly, his voice breaking through the stunned silence, that the evidence speaks for itself. The jury will see a clear, unprovoked attack with a deadly weapon. The jury will see a trained officer responding with appropriate force. The jury will see the truth. He turned to, "Ms., I understand that your job was to defend your client. You have done so skillfully. However, I believe we have now reached a point where additional legal arguments would be an offense to justice itself. Do you wish to present closing arguments?" Looked up slowly, her expression hollow. She stood and her voice was barely above a whisper. "No, Your Honor, I don't think that will be necessary." It was a stunning admission of defeat. She wasn't going to fight. She wasn't going to attempt to spin the footage. She wasn't going to try to introduce more doubt. She understood that the moment of the truth had arrived, and there was no strategy in the world that could overcome it. Judge nodded, his expression showing something that might have been respect for her recognition of reality. "Very well. Mister, do the people wish to present closing arguments?" Robert stood. "Your Honor, I believe the video evidence presented speaks more eloquently than anything I could say. I would request that we proceed directly to jury instructions and deliberation." "Agreed," Judge said. He turned to the jury. "Members of the jury, you have seen the evidence. You have heard testimony. You have viewed the body camera footage. Now you will retire to deliberate and reach your verdict based on what you have seen and heard. Remember, your duty is to discover and affirm the truth. Nothing more, nothing less." As the jury filed out to begin their deliberation, every person in the courtroom understood that the trial had effectively concluded. The verdict was inevitable. Had attacked Officer Martinez with a knife. The video proved it beyond any shadow of doubt. There would be no acquittal, no hung jury, no last-minute legal maneuver that could change the fundamental reality of what had occurred. Emma sat in her seat, her small hand still gripping her mother's, feeling the weight of what she had accomplished. She had pointed at the dog. She had spoken truth, and truth had prevailed. The jury room was quiet in a way that jury rooms rarely are. 90 minutes. That was how long it took for 12 citizens to deliberate on a case that had consumed the better part of a week in courtroom proceedings. 90 minutes to review evidence that had been presented through testimony, cross-examination, legal argument, and finally, irrefutable video footage. Most jury deliberations took hours, sometimes days, as jurors struggled to reconcile competing narratives and find certainty amid complexity. But this jury faced no such struggle. They had seen the truth with their own eyes, recorded in real time, impossible to deny or misinterpret. The jury foreman, a woman named Oakes who worked as a school administrator, had polled the other jurors within the first 10 minutes of entering the deliberation room. The vote was unanimous, guilty on all counts. There had been no argument, no dissent, no juror attempting to introduce doubt or argue for acquittal. They had simply looked at each other, understood what they had witnessed, and reached the only conclusion that was possible given the evidence. The remaining 80 minutes had been spent discussing the appropriate weight to give to different aspects of the evidence, ensuring that every juror understood the legal standards they were supposed to apply, and preparing themselves emotionally for returning a guilty verdict. Several of the jurors had been troubled by the certainty of it all, troubled by the reality that a man's life was about to be dramatically altered. But all of them understood that their personal feelings about the consequence could not influence their duty to serve truth and justice. Now, as they filed back into the courtroom, the energy in the room had shifted entirely. The earlier tension and uncertainty had been replaced by a strange kind of calm resignation. Everyone knew what was coming. The only remaining question was the formality of hearing the verdict spoken aloud. Judge resumed his position on the bench. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" he asked formally. Oak stood. "We have, Your Honor." "And how do you find the defendant on the charge of assault on a police officer with a deadly weapon?" "Guilty, Your Honor." The word hung in the courtroom like a bell that had just been struck. Guilty. Not guilty. Not we cannot agree. But guilty. The entire case had been decided in 90 minutes based on video evidence that Officer Martinez's body camera had recorded. His face had gone white. His defense attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, but whether it was meant to comfort or simply to restrain him, it was impossible to say. Looked as though he might stand up and protest, but the courtroom bailiffs had positioned themselves strategically, and their presence was enough to keep him seated. Officer Martinez had closed his eyes and his shoulders were shaking again. His attorney, Robert, placed a hand on his colleague's back, and when Officer Martinez opened his eyes, tears were streaming down his face. After 6 months of living in uncertainty, after enduring the defense's insinuations and skillful attempts to create reasonable doubt, after fearing that justice might not be served, the verdict had finally come. Guilty. His attacker would face consequences. The truth had prevailed. Emma had gasped when the foreman spoke the word. She understood at her 7-year-old level that something important had just been decided. Her father had been telling the truth, and now everyone had acknowledged it. Her mother's grip on her hand loosened slightly, and when Emma looked up at her mother's face, she saw tears but also relief, the kind of relief that comes when a burden that has been carried for months is finally set down. The courtroom proceedings continued according to protocol. Judge scheduled a sentencing hearing for 2 weeks later. During that time, both the prosecution and defense would prepare sentencing recommendations. The probation department would conduct an investigation. There would be opportunities for victim impact statements. But everyone understood that the most important decision had already been made, was guilty, and he would serve time. 2 weeks later, when the sentencing hearing took place, Judge had reviewed all the relevant documents, had a history of violence. He had prior convictions for assault. He had shown no remorse during the trial proceedings. The attack on Officer Martinez had been unprovoked, sudden, and vicious. There were no mitigating circumstances. Judge imposed a sentence of 5 years in federal prison. Not the maximum sentence possible, but a substantial punishment that reflected the severity of the crime and the potential for harm to the community. As the bailiffs led away, shackled and defeated, the trial effectively came to an end. But something extraordinary happened as court was being adjourned. Judge Harrison called out, his voice cutting through the noise of the courtroom. "Officer Martinez and his family, could you please come to my chambers? There is something I would like to discuss with you." Emma's mother exchanged a confused look with her husband. Judges didn't typically invite families to their private chambers, but they stood up, with Emma between them, and were escorted by a bailiff through a side door that led to the judge's private office. The chambers were exactly what one might expect: mahogany wood paneling, law books lining the shelves, windows overlooking the city, and the judge's large oak desk. Judge was removing his black robes as they entered, and he hung them carefully on a stand in the corner. Without the robes, he looked like an ordinary elderly gentleman, but his eyes still possessed that same sharp intelligence and moral clarity that had guided his actions throughout the trial. "Please sit," he said, gesturing to the comfortable chairs positioned in front of his desk. Officer Martinez sat first, then Maria, with Emma perched carefully on her mother's lap. Judge settled into the chair behind his desk, and for a long moment he simply looked at the family, his expression warm and genuine. "Officer Martinez," he began, his voice carrying the weight of sincerity, "I want you to know that your professionalism throughout this ordeal has been exemplary. You were attacked without provocation, and you responded with exactly the appropriate level of force. You acted as a trained professional should act, with courage and restraint. I want you to know that I recognize that, and more importantly, I want you to know that justice has been served." Officer Martinez nodded, unable to speak, tears streaming down his face again. Judge then turned to Emma, and his expression softened even further. He leaned forward and looked directly into the little girl's eyes. "And you," he said gently, "have taught me something that I needed to remember. In 38 years of practicing law, I had begun to complicate justice. I had begun to allow procedure and legal maneuvering to obscure the fundamental purpose of the law, which is to serve truth. He paused, allowing his words to settle. You pointed at that dog and said something that seems simple but contains profound wisdom. That dog knows the truth. And in that moment, you reminded me of why I became a judge in the first place. Not to oversee legal games, but to serve justice. You reminded me that sometimes truth is simple, and sometimes we need to look at the world with the clarity that children possess. Emma didn't fully understand all of what the judge was saying, but she understood that he was praising her, that he was acknowledging that what she had done mattered. Your father is a good man who was wronged, Judge continued, his gaze shifting between Emma and Officer Martinez. Today, the system worked the way it was supposed to work. Justice was served, and you, young lady, played a role in making sure that happened. He stood up and the family understood that the meeting was coming to an end, but as they were leaving, Judge called out one more time. Officer Martinez, I hope you will return to full duty soon. The community needs good officers like you, officers who act with professionalism and integrity, officers who serve with honor. Officer Martinez nodded, unable to speak, and he placed his arm around his daughter as they left the chambers. Emma held her father's hand tightly, feeling the warmth of his grip, understanding that something fundamental had shifted in their family's life. The attack that had shadowed them for 6 months had been acknowledged and avenged through the legal system. Justice had prevailed, and she, a 7-year-old girl, had played a role in making it happen. 2 years had passed since that pivotal day in the courtroom, when a 7-year-old girl's simple observation had shifted the entire trajectory of a trial and awakened something fundamental within an aging judge. Judge Harrison sat in his chambers on his final day before retirement, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of his 38 years on the bench. Law books that had guided his decisions, framed photographs with fellow judges and attorneys, commendations from various legal organizations. On his desk, prominently displayed, was a single photograph that a courthouse photographer had captured during that extraordinary trial. The image was remarkable for its composition. In the foreground, 7-year-old Emma stood with her arm extended, her small finger pointing directly at Duke, the police dog. In the background, frozen in that perfect moment of stunned silence, was the entire courtroom. Lawyers with their pens stopped mid-motion, the judge with his hand paused mid-gesture, the jury members turning in unison to look at the child. It was as if the photograph had captured not just a moment in time, but a transformation in progress. The image had been published in legal journals, discussed in law school classrooms, and become something of a symbol in judicial circles, a reminder of what justice was supposed to be. Judge picked up the photograph and held it to the light streaming through his office window. He had received numerous letters and communications in the 2 years since the trial. Academic papers had been written analyzing his decision to present the body camera footage without following standard procedure. Some legal scholars had criticized his actions as a violation of proper judicial process. Others had praised him as a beacon of judicial wisdom who understood that justice transcended procedure. There was one letter, however, that sat in a special place in his desk drawer, a handwritten note from Officer Martinez's family. Judge retrieved it now, handling it with the care one might reserve for a sacred document. Your Honor, words cannot adequately express our family's gratitude for your wisdom and compassion during our trial. More than serving justice, you taught us all that the law exists to serve truth, not procedure. Our daughter Emma keeps the photograph of that day on her bedroom wall. She tells everyone that she helped the judge remember why he became a judge. I don't know if you realize the impact your words and actions have had on our family. My father was able to return to full duty. He has received several commendations for his service since the trial, but more importantly, our family has healed. We sleep peacefully at night knowing that justice was served. Thank you for listening to a child's voice. Thank you for reminding us all what justice means. With deepest gratitude, Officer David Martinez and family. Judge had read this letter dozens of times over the past 2 years. Each time he read it, he felt the same mixture of emotions: pride in the outcome, humility at the recognition, and a profound sense that his career had ultimately served a purpose greater than he had sometimes believed possible. The impact of the trial had extended far beyond the Martinez family. Legal scholars had begun examining the concept of judicial discretion and the balance between procedure and justice. Law schools had incorporated discussions of the case into their curricula. Several states had begun re-examining their rules of evidence to consider how judges might have more flexibility in presenting crucial evidence to juries when justice demanded it. The defense attorney who had fought so hard to create reasonable doubt had experienced a transformation of her own. 6 months after the trial, she had quietly left her firm and taken a position with a legal aid organization, defending clients who truly could not afford representation. She had never publicly commented on her decision, but those who knew her well understood that the trial had forced her to confront something about herself, that there was a difference between serving justice and simply serving clients at any cost. Judge had seen at a legal conference the previous year. They had spoken briefly and had told him something that stayed with him. That girl in the courtroom taught me what I had forgotten, that our role as attorneys is not to win, but to serve justice. I'm not sure I can fix the cases where I failed to remember that, but I can certainly remember it moving forward. Duke, the police dog who had been at the center of Emma's observation, had become something of a celebrity in police circles. The K-9 unit had been featured in several news stories about animal-assisted law enforcement. Duke had served another 4 years in the police department before retiring at age 10. He had lived out his final years in comfort, cared for by the department, and celebrated as a hero. The most significant legacy, however, was the impact on Emma herself. The 7-year-old girl who had pointed at the dog and spoken truth had grown into a conscious young teenager who understood the power of speaking up, the importance of truth, and the role that ordinary people could play in ensuring justice. Emma had kept that photograph on her bedroom wall, exactly as her mother had mentioned in the letter. But she had also begun reading about the law, about justice, about the legal system. At age 12, Emma had written a school essay titled Truth Over Procedure, The Role of Integrity in Justice, in which she discussed her experience in the courtroom and reflected on what it meant to serve justice. The essay had won a regional writing competition and had been published in a youth-oriented legal magazine. In the essay, Emma had written, "When I pointed at Duke, I wasn't thinking about the law or procedure. I was thinking about something simple, that the dog knew the truth, and the truth mattered more than anything else. I think that's what judges and lawyers need to remember. Truth matters more than winning. Justice matters more than procedure." Now, as Judge approached his final day on the bench, he had made a decision. He would retire, but he would not simply disappear into the retirement that so many judges before him had chosen. He had been invited to teach a course at the State University Law School. The course would be titled Justice and Integrity, The Pursuit of Truth Through Law. In that course, he planned to discuss his 38 years of judicial experience, but also to use the Martinez trial as a central case study, not as a legal precedent, but as a meditation on what justice truly meant. He had prepared a lecture for his first class session, and it began with the photograph. He planned to show it to his students and tell them the story of the day when an aging judge had been reminded by a 7-year-old child why he had become a judge in the first place. As Judge packed the last of his personal items from his chambers, he paused to look around the space one final time. The mahogany desk where he had written thousands of decisions, the law books that had guided his rulings, the windows overlooking the city that he had served for nearly 4 decades, and the photograph, the image of Emma pointing at Duke, frozen forever in the moment when truth had prevailed over manipulation, when justice had overcome procedure. He carefully placed the photograph in his briefcase, along with Officer Martinez's letter. These were the items he wanted to carry forward into his next chapter, not the commendations or the professional achievements, but the evidence that his work had mattered, that his decisions had touched lives, that in the end, the law could serve its highest purpose, the pursuit and protection of truth. Officer David Martinez had returned to full duty and had eventually been promoted to detective. He had worked on several high-profile cases, always with the same professionalism and integrity that had been evident in that body camera footage. Emma's mother, Maria, had become an advocate for victims of violent crime, using her family's experience to help other families navigate the legal system. And Emma, the remarkable 7-year-old girl who had spoken truth in a courtroom filled with legal complexities, had grown into a conscious young person who understood that ordinary people could make extraordinary differences. At 14 years old, she had decided that she wanted to study law. Her inspiration came from that day in the courtroom and from the judge who had listened to her. When Judge finally walked out of the courthouse for the last time, carrying his briefcase and his memories, he understood that his greatest achievement had not been any particular legal decision or precedent he had established. His greatest achievement had been remembering, with the help of a child's wisdom, that the law existed to serve justice, and that sometimes the path to justice required courage, integrity, and the willingness to listen to truth from whatever source it came, even from the voice of a 7-year-old girl pointing at a dog. The sun was setting as he walked down the courthouse steps, casting long shadows across the marble plaza. In his pocket was a letter he had written but not yet sent, a letter to Emma Martinez, thanking her for teaching him the most important lesson of his judicial career. That truth, when spoken with integrity and clarity, had the power to change everything.